And we're going to pick it up in verse 7. We're not really covering verses 1 to 6, but really there he has a challenge, warning rich oppressors. And it seems like it's a shout to people who are outside the church. And it seems like this is something that the people within the church have experienced and gone through. And he's hoping that this spreads and the word gets out there. But now he addresses the people in the church. And here's what he says. So just a few verses from verse 7. Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. Let your yes be yes and your no, no, or you will be condemned. Okay, let's pray. Father, I pray that you would guide our hearts, help us in our understanding, Father. Even the words that I say, Father, may you speak through your word and the exposition and the teaching of your word, Father. Speak into our hearts, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So a couple of things about the passage. First of all, just observations as we go. So James is bringing all, and many of the themes that he's already brought up, he's bringing them into this particular passage. You mightn't see it at first glance, but a lot of the themes that he has already mentioned, and you remember at the beginning, we talked about his rabbinic style where he revisits ideas and they're all sort of all over the place. So this happens very much in this particular passage. So a couple of things. He adds to his teaching in suffering. Now that's the main bulk of what he's talking about. And if you remember in chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, he talks about suffering and he says this: consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So we need to read this passage that we've just read in the context of what he has said here in chapter 1, okay? So in this passage, chapter 1, he's talking about what suffering does for us. And in many ways, our response to that should be pure joy. Why? Because it brings maturing, it brings not lacking anything within our lives. And so there should be joy in our lives. That's what suffering does. But actually in this particular portion, he talks about how we get through suffering. Some of the ideas around, here's how you can move through it. So what suffering does, but in this passage that we've read tonight, this is how you can get through. Again, he's so practical, which I absolutely love. So we're going to look at that in a moment. But also, James has talked a lot about the use of the tongue. And on a number of occasions in this passage that we've just read, he challenges them, like, don't grumble, don't swear. You know, it's this idea of watch your tongue. So he's still revisiting these ideas. He's also talked a lot about consistency and the idea of character, and he says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. So he's been carrying these themes through. We can see how they're all knitting together as well. And also, like in the first chapter, when his talk and suffering led him to guiding anyone struggling with trials, to see them for what they were, but also he leads them into prayer. So if anyone lacks wisdom, let him pray and believe that he'll receive that from God. And he talks about faith. So our response to suffering, prayer and faith. And it's exactly what he leads us into here. We'll be looking at that next week. The idea of suffering, what's next? Prayer and faith. The prayer of the faith, the prayer and the faith of the righteous man. All of that stuff, okay? So you see this pattern evolving as we look into the particular book of James. Also, this passage is really pastoral. So he's he's already talked about in the first 5 or 6 verses in James chapter 5, he's talked about the rich oppressors. And it does seem the way that he has termed what he is about to say, that the people he's writing to have suffered from these rich oppressors. So there's difficulty, there's persecution. And remember, again, back to the first week, we talked about the difficulties in the context of the people to whom James is writing. And so he's now turning to them. He's done what Jesus would have done. There's like condemnation and woes to those who aren't living right. And then now what he's doing, he's drawn into those who are suffering because of that not living right. And he's drawn in and he's been really pastoral. One of the reasons we say that is that he mentions the word brethren or brothers. And many of our translations now just say brothers and sisters, but he does that 4 times within those couple of verses, and it's nearly like he's trying to eyeball them. He's trying to just draw in and connect with them as they're walking through. There's also 3 commands in this passage: be patient, don't grumble, don't swear. There's also then 3 examples that he gives around patience: the farmer, the prophets, and Job. And as we've said, he references brothers and sisters 4 times. The other thing that he references 4 times, I love all that symmetry. It's very rabbinic. But there's another thing he talks about 4 times, and it's patience. And patience is the main thing that he talks about here. Anybody given up praying on patience? Because anytime you pray for patience, it's like the Lord puts stuff in front of you. You're like, no, I'm all right, Lord. I don't need patience. Thanks very much. But anyway, he talks about patience 4 times. So let's look at the idea of patience. What does he say? Actually, he uses 2 words. So again, a wee Greek lesson for us tonight. He uses 2 words for patience. One he uses 3 times. So the first one is makrothemeo, right? Easy for you to say. Makrothemeo, and it uses a version later on in verse 10, makrothemia, but it's the same idea. And it means to persevere, be patient, or to be patient, or the Old English word of long suffering. That's what those words carry the idea of. And then the other word that he uses is hypomenen, and it means to be patient, to endure. And it carries this idea of a remaining behind, or, and I like this terminology, a remaining under. There's a burden to carry. Sometimes there's a remaining under that burden and a holding up of that burden. It's what that word carries the idea, the picture of what it's speaking to us. The first word, the makrothemeo and makrothemia, it carries the idea of being patient with people. Okay, so it carries an idea of long suffering, it's the opposite of short-tempered. It's long suffering, right? So then that's our interaction with people. The other word, hypomenen, carries the idea of endurance under great stress. So it's about our circumstances. It's about the life and the things that are external around us. It's the stuff of life. The first one's the people. The other one's the stuff of life. So it's quite a rounded passage where he talks about patience with people who are mistreating you, as well as endurance in the midst of difficult circumstances. R.J. Noling expresses their respective meanings very exactly when he says that patience is the self-restraint that does not hastily retaliate against a wrong, and steadfastness, or this idea of endurance, is the temper which does not easily succumb under suffering. Patience. And I think whenever we use the word patience, we mean both of those things. And so it helps us understand what James is saying. James is calling for patience in the life of the believer in both instances. Again, remember the context. There's persecution for these people. There's oppression. There's injustice. They're being mistreated from the people in Jerusalem. Again, remind ourselves that this is very much the same atmosphere that seeing Jesus crucified in Jerusalem. This is the church in Jerusalem. Mainly, I know he's writing to all other, but his mind is essentially first and foremost on those people within Jerusalem. And so he's calling them in the midst of this oppression, in the midst of you being mistreated by people, have patience, be long-suffering. In the midst of these difficult times, endure, hold up under it is what he's saying. Don't crack under the pressure of it. Endure through it. And so, again, his message to us is exactly that. If the sufferings and the trials that we go through are to be endured in a godly manner, in a way that allows God's work in us, because remember, suffering, when we do it right, if that makes sense, with God's help, it produces something in us. It does something within our hearts and within our lives. So if we are to endure it in a godly manner, in a way that allows God's work to be done in us, then we have to have patience for that to work, for that to go. And we have to have patience with the people that wrong us. I don't know about you, I find that difficult. Everybody else want to put our hands up? Patience with the people who wrong us, oppress us, or persecute us. One commentator, a guy called Simon J. Kistemaker, what a name, says this about long suffering. He says, to be patient, as James uses the word, is much more than passively waiting for the time to pass. Patience is the art of enduring someone whose conduct is incompatible with that of others and sometimes even oppressive. There's a word for it. We've all heard from God today, haven't we? We can go home now. It's like, okay, yep, we definitely need that. Consider Peter's question to Jesus in Matthew 18:21-22. And says there, then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? What does Jesus say? He says up to 7 times, or some translations are 7 times 7 or 70 times 7. The idea is keep going. You endure under it. You have long suffering. And so that's the challenge, but 77 times. Wow, what a challenge. And I don't know about you, I've been challenged with that lately. Challenged with, how long do I have to put up with this behavior of this person? How long do I have, none of you by the way, how long do I have to, and again the challenge comes back from the Lord. Keep going, endure under it, treat people the way, not in the way that they're treating you, respond differently, live differently, and it's not easy, but it allows the work of God to progress within our hearts and within our lives. So it's this patience with other people, but also it's endurance in the midst of difficulty and trials and our circumstances and situations around us, that we have the strength to endure under it. There are times when things seem far too much for us. But what James is teaching us is that God redeems every bit of suffering that we walk through. That God is able to take those things that happen to us. And let me say for the record, I don't believe that God's the master or the architect of suffering, but I believe He's the redeemer of suffering. And I believe that He can take those moments and those seasons in our lives and the difficulties and the trials and the weight that they bring upon our lives, and He brings something beautiful out of it. And it's up to us to trust His sovereignty in those moments, and up to us to trust in Him that He can mature us, bring us to the point that we are not lacking anything through those moments. Warren Wiersbe says this: there can be no victories without battles. There can be no peaks without valleys. If you want the blessing, listen to this, you must be prepared to carry the burden and fight the battle. So James' imperative, and it is an imperative, it's a command, is be patient. Be patient. It's a command and it's an encouragement all at the same time. Be patient. But again, I just love how practical James is. It's not just, oh, by the way, guys, be patient, and he walks away. He actually tells us how we can walk in patience, how we can feed that patience within our lives. And actually, it's all about perspective. And so in this passage, he tells us to look. First thing he tells us to look is this. He says, look up. If you want patience, look up, brothers and sisters. Verse 7, be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. He points us to the hope that is to come. Look up. The word that he actually uses here is the Greek word parousia. It's the word that describes, it's used throughout the New Testament for the second coming of Jesus, for the fact that Jesus is coming. In Acts 1:11, whenever Jesus ascends into heaven, and the disciples and the folks that were with Jesus at that moment, they're looking up into the sky, and the response from the angels is this in Acts 1:11. Men of Galilee, they said, why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. We believe in the bodily return of Jesus Christ. We believe he is coming again, the parousia, the coming of the Lord. Now, we might all have different ideas of all of the ways that might happen, and the processes and the progresses, and is it premillennial, amillennial, postmillennial, pre-trib, mid-trib, post, all that. He's coming. right? He's coming, praise the Lord. And that's what we look towards. We rejoice in the fact that there is coming a day when wrongs will be righted, when justice will flow like a river, when tears are wiped from our eyes, when all of this suffering and all of the difficulty that we've walked through is completely and perfectly redeemed, and we will see him and walk with him. There's something about real hope, and sometimes we forget about this in our walk because life can be so comfortable, but it's amazing when we go through trials and difficulty, suddenly the second coming becomes a thing that's very much in our focus because it is our hope. It is something that we look towards. Paul encouraged the church at Thessalonica, and he said to them, look up. 1 Thessalonians 4:13-18. We reserve this often for funerals and moments like that, but we mustn't forget this. Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind. In other words, there's grief, there's moments of difficulty, and especially he's talking about those who have passed away. There's these moments of grief and difficulty, but there's also, it's tinged with hope. Why? Because Jesus is coming again. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. According to the Lord's word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel and the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage each other with these words. Look up. Look up in the moments of grief and difficulty and suffering and trial. Look up. In our passage, James encourages the believers. The Lord's coming is near. Now, of course, the early church expected Jesus to come in their lifetime. The disciples expected the second coming to come in their lifetime. And as we read and we look at the commentators, and they say this idea of near isn't necessarily a time word, but it is a closeness. It's an imminent word. We should live with the expectation that Jesus could come. Every generation is to live with the expectation that Jesus could come at any moment, and that should bring great hope to us. The parousia could happen. It is imminent. It should feel near. It should feel like this could happen at any moment. Jesus could come again. It speaks of our need to be living ready, to be alert, to be living with the hope and the expectation that Jesus is coming soon. So Paul, he says to the Thessalonians, encourage each other with these words. And James says something really beautiful in verse 8. He says, be patient and stand firm. On the basis of the coming of the Lord. The Lord's coming is soon, so stand strong. And he says those words, be patient and stand firm. In fact, for some reason, the translators translated be patient and stand firm. But actually the words literally mean there, be patient and strengthen your heart. I thought that was beautiful. Be patient, strengthen your heart. So encourage, strengthen your heart. You're feeling weak and weary of the fight, strengthen your heart because the Lord's coming is near. Look up. Hold on. Be strong. Carries the idea of this internal steadfastness, this internal strength that comes when we realize that the Lord is coming. So strengthen your hearts. Encourage each other with these words. Jesus is coming again. And there is coming a day, we've said it already, when justice will be done, the oppressed shall be freed, the persecuted liberated, and those in sorrow will have every tear wiped from their eyes. I've said it again, I'll say it once more. Jesus is coming again. So look up. Have hope. Keep going. Have an eternal perspective on the things that are going on. That's what looking up does. It's not just the here and the now. It's not just the life that I'm living in this moment, the decades or the whatever it might be. There's so much more. So look up. Here's what Paul says to give us that perspective. 2 Corinthians 4:16-18. Therefore we do not lose heart. No, we strengthen our hearts. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles, can I remind you of the things that he went through? I don't have time to keep go through the list. So he's not, things haven't been easy for him. But our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So fix your eyes. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Look up. How do you garner patience in the midst of trial? Look up. Second one is look back. And James gives us 3 examples of how we could look back to examples of what it looks like to be patient. The first one is the farmer, and forgive me if I fly, because I have so much material tonight and I want to get finished on time. But the farmer, he understands that there are seasons. This is the first illustration. He understands that there are seasons, that he has to wait. The autumn rains come, and the autumn rains come to soften up the hard soil after the summer. And in those moments, he's able to plough and sow his seeds. But there's not an awful lot that he can do. He has to wait. He can't force it. The germination has to take place. There's a number of months where underneath the soil, where nobody sees anything going on, where he can't see that it's definitely happening and definitely working, but the roots are starting to grow. It's starting to shoot. It's starting to do what it's meant to do, but he still can't see it. So he has to wait. And then the spring rains come, and the spring rains come to feed the roots, and suddenly a shoot starts to come, and then suddenly fruit starts to come. But there's been a whole process, and that's what James is drawing us towards. So in the midst of our lives, we need to understand that there are seasons. There are times when God is using circumstances to soften us and sow things into our lives. Those are what trials do for us. There are times that we can't see what is happening, and it's easy to get frustrated. Anybody else? It's really easy to get frustrated and lose hope. But we must have patience. There will be times when the seasons shift and the rain comes again. See, if the farmer starts to think to himself, there's nothing happening, and he starts to dig up the seeds and he starts to mess about and he starts to try and mess with the process, well, he's just going to wreck the whole thing. There's going to have to be patience. And in our lives, there's times when we just have to trust the Lord. Even when I don't see it, you're working. We need to trust the Lord, even though I can't see it. You're doing underground work, Lord. You're doing stuff that's establishing. You're doing things that really, really matter. Because there will come a moment whenever the season shifts and whenever the spring rains come, and the fruit of those moments and the fruit of those trials and the difficulties then starts to show within our lives, and it starts to show in our character. It starts to show in our compassion. It starts to show in our lives. That's what God wants to do as He redeems the suffering and trials in our lives. The farmer also understands, so it's the idea of seasons, having to wait, but the farmer also understands that he's not in control of the seasons. That there's a massive element of trust. And especially like our farmers here. Now, in fairness, we know that we can have sometimes too hot weather, sometimes too much rain, sometimes too much. So the farmer has to trust. And the believing farmer has to just say, Lord, it's in your hands. I actually have no control over whether it rains or whether it doesn't. I have no control over whether there's a heat wave whenever I need it to not be so hot. I have no control over those moments, so I have to trust in you. And I think that's what James is getting at for us as well. That there are moments in our lives where we have to say, God, there's some of these things that I have no control over. And so I have to rest in you and believe that you're sovereign over all of them. The second illustration that he gives is the prophets. And he talks about the prophets and how they persevered. They continued to proclaim the word of the Lord even when oppressed and persecuted. Even when people oppressed them and did hateful things to them, they continued to be faithful in the things of God. Consider Jeremiah. Jeremiah, we think he's great, but his generation didn't. They persecuted, they pushed him out, they scorned him, they threw him down into a cistern to be ignored and to die. They treated him terribly. Think of Daniel and how he was treated by his generation, thrown by the king in front of hungry lions. We think, oh, they're brilliant, but in their generation, they weren't lauded and applauded. But they stayed faithful. Many others we could keep on talking about. And so the challenge for us is that we, in the midst of suffering and difficulty, we have to persevere, not give in and not give up. Allow our life and words in the midst of suffering to be a witness and a testimony to the people who are around us. I don't know about you, it is some of the people who have gone through some of the most horrific things, and they talk, and you see their lives, and there's a sweetness and a beauty and a drawing others closer to God because of what they've walked through. Anybody ever heard Helen Roosevelt talk and her story? And her, I'm not even going to say it, but her, and the sweetness that came from that lady. There's other people that I think of, Joni Erickson, and you listen to how she talks about the Lord and her example through suffering. I think of personal friends of ours, Andy and Pat Carty. Pat's away to glory just not so long ago, but who lost their daughter to a child serial killer in the 70s, and just watching their journey, of how they trusted God through that. They toured the country talking about their faith, and you would have seen them on various other things, but to see the faith and the trust in God and the witness that came from that. Lots of the reporters, BBC, ITV reporters, were massively moved behind the scenes as they talked about forgiveness, as they talked about love for this serial killer who was only probably about 10 years ago or so found guilty, and they actually were praying that he gets saved. We're praying that he doesn't go to hell, that he goes to heaven. What a witness that was to so many people. Warren Wiersbe, again, he's so quotable. He says, we need to remind ourselves that our patience in times of suffering is a testimony to others around us. The important thing, he goes on to say this, the important thing is that, like the farmer, we keep working, and like the prophets, we keep witnessing, no matter how trying the circumstances may be. Third example is Job. Again, we know Job, and remember, the people that James is writing to know all of these stories, so he just has to mention a word, and it brings up all of the Sunday school stories. Of course, they didn't have Sunday school, they were just schooled in it all the time. Okay, but it brings up all of this, so he's able just to throw this in. Again, another rabbinic way of teaching. But it's really important to include, and let me just highlight this aspect of it. Somewhere in the course of Judaism, and it certainly was prevalent in Jesus' day, the idea, they knew they were the blessed people of God, but the idea was that blessing looked like prospering. We've heard that before, haven't we? That blessing looked like prospering. And so there was this idea that the rich were blessed of God and that they were favoured by God, and the poor weren't. That if you were going through difficult times, that God had obviously taken his eye off you, but if you were getting life on easy street, that God was favouring you. There was this idea, now I've put that in very simple terms, but there was this idea that was carried there. It's why, for example, when Jesus talks to the rich man and he tells him to give up everything and follow him, and he walks away, and the disciples are like, Jesus says how difficult it is for a rich man to come into the kingdom of God, and they're going, woof, the rich man can't get in. How can anybody get in? Why? Because they had this view that the rich were the favoured of God, that they had God's favour, God's blessing, that God was already over it with them, and them as like poor people, God's not really looking at us, God's not really interested in us. And yet in the book of Job, we see that suffering and trials has nothing to do with the favour of God. In fact, Job was favoured by God. In fact, God went to the devil. Have you thought about Job? I think he's brilliant. There was absolute favour over his life, and yet trials and difficulties came. So in effect, James is saying this, and this is really important for us as well. Don't view your trials as the absence of God or the lack of blessing in your life. Don't view trials as those things. And we can. God, why am I going through this? Have I done something wrong? Have I? Not necessarily. Don't view trials as the absence of God or the lack of blessing in your life. Rather, use those trials as an opportunity to stay steadfast and trust in God through it all. Thirdly, and finally, better be quick, is to look out. So we'll look up, we'll look back to those examples, and we look out, because actually there's warnings here. And James puts them throughout. Warnings not to lose your patience in the trials and use your tongue in an unhealthy manner. That's good advice, actually, isn't it? Because here's what he's saying. If you lose your patience, and let's consider the farmer, you lose your patience, you could trample all over the stuff that God's trying to do and ruin the harvest that God wants for your life. Let me give you a few examples of how that might happen. A guy called Abraham, God gives him a promise. I'm going to make you a father over many descendants. And he lost his patience. And Sarah lost her patience. And so Hagar came along. And Ishmael came along, and there was a whole conglomeration of bad stuff that came out of that. The prophet who stops declaring the word, and consider the prophet who stops declaring the word and turns on the people that he's supposed to be guiding. Imagine Job if he had have actually listened to his wife, cursed God and died. He'd have missed on the extra blessing at the end of his life. And so James is trying to say to them, be really careful, guys, because we can mess this up. We can, through losing our patience, not bearing underneath it, through pushing hard against the oppressor, through opening our mouths in a very careless way, we can ruin the harvest that God wants to bring about in our lives. I don't know about you, I find that really challenging. He talks about two things. First one is, he says, don't grumble, guys. Now, they had heard grumble, and I guarantee they would have gone straight back to the people in the wilderness. What happened there? They grumbled, and the whole generation missed out in the promised land. They ruined the harvest that God had intended for them by being careless with their mouths, by not being patient, by not trusting God in the midst of it. And so he's challenging us, don't grumble. This idea of grumbling carries not just the words, but this inner sign, this fed upness. He doesn't give us it, but can I give you a really good antidote to grumbling? Thankfulness. Gratitude. Don't grumble, be grateful. Honestly, if you have a tendency, and I do this in my life, I promise you, I start to grumble or moan or give off, or right? We're all capable of it. Yeah? It's thankfulness, gratitude. Lord, thank you for the air that I'm breathing. Thank you that I was able to wake up this morning. Thank you that I had a choice of breakfasts. Thank you that I've got clothes to wear. Thank you that I'm not just saying the words, feeling the gratefulness. Thank you, Lord. Promise you, if you ever starting to feel, start to be grateful. Start to look in your life for the good things that God has brought into your life. And the second thing he challenges them, in fact, let me go back to that. An antidote to this grumble or groaning and grumbling is thankfulness and joy. And as I say, James does give us that in the first chapter. Consider it pure joy. Walk in joy, walk in gratitude, walk in thankfulness. The second one is not to swear. Now, he doesn't mean bad words, but don't make oaths, don't say things. The direct purpose of this being here is that sometimes when we are in a tight spot, we can make all kinds of promises and all kinds of bargains. For example, God, if you get me out of this, I'll serve you for the rest of my life. God, if you'll only help me with that, I'll do this, that, and the other. And God's, come on. Be really careful with the promises and the things that you say. And that's what James is saying. Be really careful. The warning is, say what you mean and mean what you say. This, of course, has a wider application into our wider lives. That there shouldn't be words out here and intention in here that are different. In fact, I read one commentator who said, actually, whenever Jesus says it, he says, let your yes, yes be yes. Right? And it's translated like that. And the idea is let your inner yes match your outer yes. And let that be yes. And that's the heart. It's that living consistent lives, walking in integrity. How we walk in patience in the midst of trial and difficulty is that looking out, being careful, consistency, integrity, being a person of character. Watch out that in the midst of your trial and difficulty that you don't compromise your character. That you don't become something on the outside that isn't represented on the inside. Be careful of that. So, conclusion. The call from James is to have patience. Patience that comes into our lives when we choose the right perspective. When we choose to look up, because Jesus is coming again. When we choose to look back at the many great examples of what such patience looks like. And we choose to look out that we don't destroy the harvest with careless talk or careless living. So may the Lord help us genuinely to live patient through trials so that we can grow in perseverance and he can continue to mature and perfect us, that we would not lack anything in him. Amen? Amen. So Lord, help us, we pray, in Jesus' name.